The air in the corporate park on the outskirts of Atlanta always felt heavy, thick with the scent of ambition and stale coffee, a peculiar blend I'd grown intimately familiar with over the decades. My office, a cubicle among 1,000 others, offered a limited view of manicured lawns and identical glass buildings, reflecting the perpetually indifferent sky. My name is Rhiannon Thorne, and at 48, I've seen enough of this world, especially the corporate one, to develop a deeply ingrained sense of jadedness, a quiet resentment that hummed beneath my skin like a low-frequency current. Every morning, the same routine, the swipe of the ID card, the fluorescent hum that never quite faded, the polite, empty greetings. I'd learned to navigate these waters with the practiced ease of a deep-sea diver, observing without truly engaging, a quiet witness to the endless theater of corporate life. Most days were a blur of spreadsheets and emails, a monotonous rhythm that threatened to lull one into a comfortable stupor. But some days, the universe, in its own peculiar way, decided to deliver a spectacle, a reminder that even in the most sterile environments, the raw, burning embers of human nature could still ignite. This particular saga, the downfall of Mark Trenton, was one such fiery display, and I watched every flicker-in moment with a grim, satisfying fascination. Mark Trenton. Even the name tasted slick and over-rehearsed. He was the golden boy, the charismatic senior manager with the perfectly coiffed hair and a smile that could sell ice to an Eskimo. Everyone loved Mark. He had that uncanny ability to make you feel like the most important person in the room, even as he was subtly extracting information or manipulating a situation to his advantage. He glided through the corridors, a master of backslapping and schmoozing, perpetually surrounded by a coterie of junior executives hanging on his every word. He represented everything I had come to distrust about this environment. The polished facade, the relentless climb, the casual disregard for anything or anyone not directly serving one's own assent. Years ago, before the deep cynicism had fully calcified my outlook, I had a different kind of trust, a foolish, naive hope that people, at their core, were decent. That illusion shattered into a million irreparable pieces one Tuesday morning, a morning that felt like any other until I reached for something that wasn't there. It was a silver locket, an antique, small and unassuming, with my grandmother's initials delicately engraved on its worn surface. My mother had given it to me, a tangible link to a past that felt increasingly distant. I kept it in the top drawer of my desk, a drawer I always locked, a small, private comfort in the sterile chaos of the office. But that morning, the drawer, despite being locked when I left the previous evening, was mysteriously ajar, and the locket, my precious, irreplaceable locket, was gone. My heart had hammered against my ribs, a frantic, desperate bird trapped in a cage. I searched frantically, tearing apart my desk, my bag, even looking under the cubicle. Nothing. A cold dread seeped into my bones, because I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the core, it hadn't just vanished. Someone had taken it. I reported it, of course. Trembling, my voice tight with unshed tears, I explained the situation to HR. A young woman, fresh out of college, with a bright, unsullied optimism I found almost painful to behold, listened patiently enough. But her eyes held that blank, professional sympathy that signals a complete lack of empathy. "I understand this is upsetting, Rhiannon," she'd said, her voice a practiced drone. "But the company policy is very clear. Personal property is the employee's responsibility. We can't be held accountable for lost or stolen items." She offered no investigation, no follow-up, just a laminated printout of the HR policy manual. It was a dismissal, plain and simple, a bureaucratic shrug that told me my personal loss was utterly meaningless in the grand scheme of corporate operations. It was then, standing in that sterile HR office, that my trust in corporate justice, in any form of justice within these walls, died. And from its ashes, a seed of quiet resentment began to sprout. That feeling, that quiet, burning indignation, festered for years. It taught me to look closer, to see the cracks in the polished facades, to understand that beneath the veneer of professionalism lay a constant, silent struggle for power and advantage. So when the subtle tremors began to ripple through Mark Trenton's seemingly unshakable empire, I was ready. I noticed everything. The fleeting frowns on the faces of his team, the hushed conversations by the water cooler, the sudden, unexplained delays in his flagship project. It was a slow burn, a gradual erosion, and it was glorious to behold. The architect of this subtle dismantling was a woman named Sarah Jenkins, new to the department, but not new to corporate warfare. She was younger than Mark, sharper, with an intensity in her eyes that reminded me of myself before the locket. Sarah was quiet, much like me, but unlike me, her silence was not resignation. It was observation, calculation. I had heard whispers that Mark had poached one of her key ideas, taking credit for a groundbreaking algorithm that promised millions in revenue, right before she was due to present it. He had presented it himself, flawlessly, to the board, securing his latest promotion and leaving Sarah's career sputtering in its wake. HR, predictably, had dismissed her claims as sour grapes. The irony was not lost on me. I saw the recognition in Sarah's eyes, a flicker of understanding when our gazes occasionally met in the break room. It was the look of someone who had also been dismissed, undervalued, and wronged by the system. She was, in her own quiet way, an extension of the anger I had bottled up for so long. She wasn't just wronged by Mark. She was wronged by the indifference of the entire corporate structure, just as I had been. So I watched her, and I watched Mark, and I waited for the inevitable collision. If you enjoy stories of quiet retribution and powerful comebacks, you should definitely subscribe to Tales of Revenge channel for new revenge stories daily. Act 2. Struggle. The first signs of Mark's unraveling were almost imperceptible, like hairline fractures appearing on a vast, polished surface. He was spearheading the Apex project, a massive undertaking designed to streamline client onboarding, promising to cut costs by 30% and increase efficiency by an even greater margin. It was his baby, his ticket to the executive suite, and he paraded it around like a prized show dog. But as the weeks turned into months, little things started to go wrong. Data silos that were supposed to connect seamlessly remained stubbornly isolated. Key performance indicators, which Mark had confidently projected as soaring, began to flatline, then subtly dip. I saw Sarah in the periphery of these events, always present, always observing, like a silent shadow. She was tasked with data analytics on a smaller, tangential project, which, conveniently for her, gave her access to the same underlying data sets Mark's project relied upon. I would sometimes see her hunched over her keyboard late at night, long after most people had left, a cup of lukewarm tea beside her, her brow furrowed in concentration. She wasn't openly sabotaging him. Her methods were far more insidious, more surgical. She was a quiet master of misdirection, a puppeteer pulling invisible strings. One afternoon, I overheard Mark's frustrated phone call from his office. His voice, usually so smooth and controlled, was laced with an unfamiliar edge. He was complaining about a glitch in the system, a minor hiccup that was causing data discrepancies. He was scrambling, trying to explain away the growing inconsistencies in the Apex project's preliminary reports. Sarah, I noticed, was at her desk, typing calmly, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk playing on her lips. She had planted seeds of doubt, not by outright lies, but by subtly manipulating the data inputs, creating anomalies that were just significant enough to cause delays and questions, but ambiguous enough to prevent immediate detection. The genius of her plan lay in its subtlety. She wasn't breaking anything. She was nudging things off balance, just enough to make Mark's project appear less robust, less perfect than he claimed. She wasn't an arsonist setting a blaze. She was a sculptor, meticulously chipping away at a statue, making it look as if it was crumbling under its own weight. She exposed flaws in the original coding, flaws that Mark, in his haste to take credit for Sarah's algorithm, had likely overlooked or ignored. She would file reports highlighting these unexpected errors, always with a tone of professional concern, never accusation. Her reports would always conclude with suggestions for further investigation, subtly pushing the onus onto Mark and his team to explain away the growing chaos. The pressure on Mark began to mount. Senior management, initially captivated by his charm and the promise of the Apex project, started to ask tougher questions. Meetings became more frequent, and Mark's confident pronouncements began to falter, replaced by vague assurances and increasingly elaborate excuses. I watched him closely in the office kitchen, seeing the tension lines etched deeper around his eyes, the forced cheerfulness in his voice as he tried to rally his increasingly demoralized team. His smooth facade was beginning to crack, revealing the brittle ego beneath. One particularly tense Monday, I saw Sarah leave a meeting with Mark and his team. Her face was impassive, but there was a spark in her eyes, a glint of something cold and determined. Later that day, an email went out from Mark's account, an internal memo detailing a critical phase shift for the Apex project, delaying its launch by another 3 weeks. It cited unforeseen technical complexities and the need for extensive reevaluation of core functionalities. I saw the exasperation on the faces of his direct reports. It was a defeat disguised as a strategic pivot. Sarah, I knew, had found a way to make those complexities unavoidable, to introduce enough uncertainty to force Mark's hand. My own work continued, the same monotonous tasks, the same quiet presence. But now, there was an undercurrent of grim entertainment that made the days less tiresome. I was a spectator to a meticulously planned corporate assassination, and the victim was the very man who had once, however indirectly, represented the indifference that had robbed me of something so precious. I never spoke to Sarah about her methods, never acknowledged that I saw what she was doing. My role was purely observational, a silent nod of approval from the sidelines. But there were moments, fleeting glances across the open-plan office, where I felt our shared understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the injustice that had been done, and the long, slow path to retribution. Mark grew more agitated. His charming smile was less frequent, replaced by a strained grimace. He snapped at his subordinates, his patience thinning like a worn-out fabric. His meetings grew longer, more heated, and the once harmonious hum of his team's section was replaced by the low thrum of discontent. He was spiraling, caught in a web of his own making, each thread woven tighter by Sarah's unseen hand. The corporate world, so eager to elevate him, was now poised to let him fall, to cut him loose the moment he became a liability. This was the way of things. The system that protected its own from small personal losses like my locket was ruthlessly efficient at purging those who threatened its bottom line. If you appreciate stories that expose the hidden machinations behind corporate success and failure, and the quiet satisfaction of justice served, then you should definitely subscribe to Tales of Revenge channel for new revenge stories daily. You won't want to miss what happens next. The tension in the office was almost palpable, a silent hum of anticipation. Everyone sensed something was amiss with Mark and the Apex project, even if they couldn't quite pinpoint the cause. I could. I saw the quiet, methodical work of Sarah, a vengeful phantom moving through the data, carefully orchestrating a symphony of corporate ruin. The pressure intensified as the final presentation date for the Apex project loomed closer. This was the presentation to the CEO and the board, the moment of truth for Mark. He was working round the clock, his office light burning late into the night. He looked haggard, his usually impeccable suits now slightly rumpled, his hair less coiffed. The charisma that had once been his shield was eroding under the relentless assault of glitches and discrepancies that he couldn't explain. Sarah, meanwhile, remained serene, focused. She was preparing her own smaller, unrelated data report for a different, lower-stakes meeting, meticulously checking figures, double-checking sources. I knew, though, that every one of her actions was designed to feed into the larger narrative of Mark's impending failure. Act 3. Revenge. The day of the Apex project presentation arrived cloaked in a rare Atlanta drizzle, mirroring the oppressive atmosphere in the building. Mark, looking pale and drawn, walked past my cubicle, his usual swagger replaced by a stiff, almost robotic gait. He clutched a thick binder, its contents supposedly a testament to his genius. I felt no pity, only a quiet, simmering anticipation. This was it, the climax of Sarah's patient, meticulous work. The presentation was held in the large boardroom on the executive floor. I wasn't invited, of course, my role was too minor. But the hum of activity, the hushed voices, the occasional bursts of frantic energy from Mark's team, all filtered down. My eyes were glued to my computer screen, but my ears were attuned to the slightest shifts in the office dynamic. The minutes crawled by, each one laden with suspense. Suddenly, around mid-morning, a piercing, high-pitched alarm blared from the executive floor. It was the fire alarm, but there was no smoke, no frantic evacuation. Just the shrill, insistent wail. A few minutes later, it cut off abruptly. Confused murmurs spread through the office. Then, more significantly, the main network went down. My computer screen froze, then flickered to black. The entire office system crashed. A collective gasp, then a wave of frustrated shouts echoed across the floor. Panic began to ripple through the open plan office. What happened? Is it a cyber attack? I just lost my work. In the midst of the chaos, I saw Sarah calmly close her laptop, her expression unreadable. She walked to the kitchen, poured herself a cup of water, and returned to her desk, a picture of serene composure amidst the storm. That's when I knew. This wasn't a random glitch. This was the crescendo. Later, the rumors started to trickle down, piecemeal, then a torrent. During Mark's presentation, right as he was about to project the final, crucial data points for the Apex project onto the massive screen, a security breach was triggered. It wasn't a hack, not in the traditional sense. It was a cascade failure, a series of seemingly innocuous, pre-programmed data anomalies that Sarah had meticulously embedded deep within the company's internal servers, specifically targeting the data streams that fed Mark's project. These anomalies, when combined with a perfectly timed, low-level system stress test Sarah had initiated remotely, caused the entire internal network to experience a critical overload. The fire alarm had been a false positive, a brief, chaotic consequence of the system's protective measures kicking in before collapsing. The system didn't just crash. It corrupted key Apex project files on Mark's presentation laptop, rendering them unreadable. The backup server, which Mark had bragged about having, was also affected, specifically the version of his project files he needed. All his carefully constructed data, all his impressive graphs and projections, became gibberish. Critical phase shift, he had announced earlier, the delays he had attributed to technical complexities. They now looked like premonitions of this spectacular failure. The executive team, especially the CEO, had been furious. Mark, flustered and stammering, couldn't access his data, couldn't demonstrate anything. He tried to improvise to talk his way through it, but without visual proof, his words rang hollow. His confident, polished facade crumbled entirely, revealing a desperate, cornered man. It was more than just a presentation gone wrong. It was a public unraveling, a catastrophic exposure of his incompetence, and more damagingly, his lack of foresight. The very system he claimed to master had betrayed him, not because it was flawed, but because someone had carefully, meticulously shown its flaws under his command. The network was eventually restored, but the damage was done. Mark Trenton was publicly humiliated. Over the next few days, the rumors solidified into cold, hard facts. An internal investigation, expedited due to the high-profile nature of the Apex project, revealed a pattern of data inconsistencies, over-optimistic projections, and more damningly, several instances where Mark had allegedly misrepresented project progress to senior management. The glitches that had plagued him for weeks, initially dismissed as minor setbacks, were now seen as systemic failures under his leadership. Sarah, who had, incidentally, submitted her own unrelated, highly accurate, and well-sourced data analysis report to her supervisor just hours before the crash, was not implicated. Her work was robust, verifiable, and stood in stark contrast to Mark's shattered credibility. The whispers intensified. Mark had been too aggressive, too quick to take credit, too careless with details. His rise, so meteoric, was now condemned as reckless. The very qualities that had propelled him forward were now the instruments of his downfall. The corporate machine, always eager to protect its image, swiftly moved to cut its losses. A week later, the official email went out. Mark Trenton has decided to pursue other opportunities, effective immediately. It was the corporate euphemism for being fired, stripped of his golden boy status and shown the door. He was gone. The office felt lighter, a quiet sigh of collective relief. His cubicle, once a beacon of his inflated ego, stood empty, a silent monument to ambition's harsh consequences. I watched it all, my quiet satisfaction growing with each passing day. It wasn't my revenge, not directly. But it was justice, a delayed, indirect, yet profoundly satisfying form of it. Sarah had achieved what HR had refused to do for me, what the system consistently failed to deliver: accountability. She hadn't just brought Mark down. She had exposed the vulnerability of the very system that allowed people like him to flourish at the expense of others. Her method was elegant, precise, and devastatingly effective. She hadn't sought outward confrontation. She had worked from within, using the system's own complexities against itself. I never spoke to Sarah about it, never gave her a knowing wink or a shared smile. That wasn't my way. But as I passed her desk one afternoon, she looked up, our eyes met, and for a fleeting moment I saw it. a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker of triumph in her gaze, a silent acknowledgement that she knew I had seen. And in that moment, I felt a deep, profound vindication, not just for the locket, but for every small injustice that had ever been swept under the corporate rug. The heirloom, irreplaceable as it was long gone. But the quiet, grim satisfaction of witnessing Mark Trenton's public downfall, orchestrated by a victim of his own callous ambition, was a treasure far more valuable. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful revenge is a dish best served not cold, but with the quiet, devastating precision of a carefully detonated truth. Subscribe to Tales of Revenge channel for new revenge stories daily.